I'm Hillary.
And I'm Rebecca, and we are
Mama Bear Apologetics.
We're just two gals talking about life's big questions from a biblical worldview. Because when it comes to the battle of ideas, we need to be able to say, mess with my kids and I will demolish your arguments.
You mess, I demolish. Got it? Capiche?
Rise up, ladies.
Rise up, Mama Bears.
This might not affect your faith,
but it might affect your children's.
Welcome to another episode of Mama Bear Apologetics. I'm Hillary.
I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Catherine.
And today we are going to be talking about a topic that I'm pretty sure that most moms out there have heard come from their child. And there's a lot of adults who've even asked this before. And that's the question, who made God? Rebecca, Catherine, have y'all gotten this one before?
Yes.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. I've had some very high-level PhD scientists ask this question, like Richard Dawkins.
And I've had my 4-year-old ask it.
Yes, that runs the gamut.
Yeah, so I don't think this is a question that really goes away, and it's kind of one of those ones where there's some questions where you have to be a little bit more intelligent or mature to even ask the question. This is one of those questions that like a 3-year-old can kind of formulate. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we're going to answer that, basically understanding where the question's coming from, because this is one of those ones where we need to not just answer the question, we actually need to go back a step of where the question's coming from. I think a lot of times people just answer the question, and I think that does our kids a disservice. But go back to where the question's coming from, and then we're going to talk a little bit more in depth. We're going to give like kind of a simple answer, kind of a medium depth answer, and then a really in-depth answer. So the first one, just understanding where the question comes from. So when you hear who made God, what question do y'all think is kind of coming before that question?
Well, it usually comes with, how did the universe come to be here? And so you tend to answer, well, God made it. And then the natural outflow of that, well, then who made God? Exactly.
But sometimes the problem with that is that the who made God comes like completely. I mean, it's like sometimes you're lucky enough that it comes in succession. Sometimes you have a kid that's been thinking about this for a while and they just kind of say who made God out of the blue, and you don't have that kind of successive questioning leading up to it. They've just been mulling it over in their minds for quite a while. So the technical answer to this is that God is a pre-existent eternal being who's capable of creating everything from nothing. But even though that is the technical answer, and it's an absolutely true answer, it can feel very unsatisfying to a lot of people. So what are some of the problems that y'all have seen come up with that answer?
Well, I can say that I think people have a hard time relating to that because we don't have anything in our immediate environment that's like that. Because by definition, that is God. And behind the assumption of the question of who made God is also the assumption that God is like us. And you can say, well, he's at least like us, but he's much greater than us and different than us. I mean, we are not eternal, self-existent, omniscient, omnipotent. So you have to people have to have a whole new kind of category of being that we just don't have in our daily experience.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes this is also why analogies for the Trinity fall flat, because it's like, how do you make comparisons? It's like we understand the unknown through what we know. So how do we understand something that's completely unique, that there's nothing else in creation like it? It's really hard for us to understand that.
Right. But I think it also speaks to the fact that we all inherently understand that things require a cause.
Yes.
So I think that's really at the heart of what's driving that question, whether they have walked through the whole progression in their mind. Like what I've seen a lot of times is, okay, so what made the universe? And you go through this explanation, well, God made the universe, and they say, well, who made God? Even if the question comes out of a seemingly random conversation, your child just burst out with it at the dinner table, it's because they have been thinking that things have a cause, because that's what we see is the distinct pattern of this nature around us, is that everything has every effect has a cause. And if this universe is an effect, there must be some sort of cause. And while a child might not think of it in those kinds of mature terms, it shows that there is that understanding that something has to explain this existence around us. And then it does, like Rebecca was saying, kind of blow out that typical box that we think in of what a cause is supposed to look like, because this is a very different cause than anything else that we would observe in nature.
The universe doesn't explain itself.
I think it's really interesting how you bring up the intuitive nature of knowing that things have a cause. Because I think about even when I was growing up and my mom, something would happen, or my mom would say, how did this get here? Or, how did the lamp break? Or, what happened here? And of course, if you and your siblings just kind of shrug your shoulders, she'll say sarcastically, oh, so I suppose it just put itself there all by itself, or it broke itself all by itself, or... it's this thing where we intuitively know that things don't happen all by themselves. We know that there has to be a cause. And it's like you don't even need to explain it. And so that's why I don't think kids even really understand. Like you said, it's more of a mature concept. So like I said, that answer can sound like a cop-out. And indeed, there's a lot of atheists who will scoff at this answer. And they'll say, oh, that's just a God of the gaps. That's just, an argument from ignorance. And so, like, our kids, even though it might seem like they accept the answer at that time, they might get to the point where they start having other people question, saying, oh, well, like what I just said, God of the gaps, ignorance and stuff like that. And it sounds like a cop-out until you start examining all the other options that you have available. And so when I've had my nephew ask me this question before, so I always take it back to asking him what he's really asking, which what he's really asking is what made the universe. That's where the question came from. So I go back to that question. Then I say, well, let's see how other people would answer how the universe got here. And the thing that we have to realize, and this is kind of like if we were going to have a thesis statement for this podcast, this would be it. It is that every other worldview believes that blank is eternally self-existent and capable of creating. And that blank, everybody fills in with something different. And all of those different things all require faith. And so this is kind of like the talk that I did with the third through fifth graders at church a couple weeks ago, where we were talking about myths. And one of the myths is that religion requires faith and science has facts. Because when we get down to the scientific, quote unquote, scientific explanations, when you get down to the very, very root cause, you end up with something blank is eternally self-existent and capable of creating, all of which you cannot prove, no matter which worldview you come from. So, Catherine, I really like the way you phrase things in your book, because one of the things that I think is your book, Teaching Others to Defend Christianity, one of the real strengths of that book is it's kind of like you take us down a road, and then we come to, instead of having like 1,000 different options, you take us down the road and say, okay, there's a fork. You can either go left or you can go right.
Right.
And you give us options for, okay, let's look at the arguments for each of those. And so we're going to kind of break it down in, Catherine Buse style here.
Good. I like that.
Yeah. And so the first fork that we're going to come to, so the idea is we're looking at where did everything come from? Is that there's either a natural explanation, there's people who believe in naturalism or supernaturalism. There's no in-betweens. Naturalism is when you believe that matter and nature are all there is. It's, the Carl Sagan, cosmos, it's all there is, ever was, and ever will be. Versus supernaturalism, which supernaturalism believes that we have all the nature, but there's also a supernature. And then, the prefix super meaning above or on top, it's a Latin prefix. So it's either only nature or nature plus something else. Those are really our only two options. So if we're going to go down the naturalism route, what do you think the naturalist would say is blank, that you fill in the blank? Blank is eternally self-existent and capable of creating.
Well, this is where they would have to plug in nature, because that's the only option that they have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, matter and energy are eternal. Yeah, I had a professor that actually told me this, So I'm like, okay.
And you're like, yeah, okay, go ahead and prove that. So, so we have a couple different kinds of naturalism. This one would be the cosmos is eternally self-existent and thus capable of creating. again, this is a faith statement. So there's what we call the static model, the cyclic or oscillating model, and the multiverse. So the static model is kind of what they had believed was how the universe was. Basically, it's kind of like, I'm trying to think of what's one of those dishes. It's kind of like Jell-O that has like the pieces of fruit in it that just stays there. It's like a suspension.
I don't know.
Just some sort of gelatinous, a gelatin mold.
It's kind of the punchline whenever the holidays come around.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the fruit cake, but that's kind of like the static model. Is like, that's the universe. All the planets are just kind of where they are, and they don't move. Then you have the cyclic and oscillating model. So the cyclic oscillating model and the multiverse try to get around the idea that the universe is all there is, was, and ever will be by postulating that there was still a beginning to the universe, but that also it was eternally self-existent. So the oscillating model, it talks about like it expands and it contracts down to this like little singular point. And then you have it's called the Big Bang and the Big Crunch, which is funny. I learned that today when I was doing some of the research for this. No one talks about the Big Crunch very much.
That's a little less pleasant.
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
A big Nestle Crunch would be fine, but sorry.
That sounds awesome. I take that. So this is one of the ways that they try to get around the fact that the universe had a beginning, because probably like it was somewhere around 1929, I think it was Hubble that came showed the redshift, on in his Hubble telescope. And Einstein had actually shown mathematically that the universe had to either be expanding or contracting, but he was like, well, that's not the case, because we know that the universe is static and unmoving. And so he introduced the cosmological constant, basically because he's like, well, these numbers can't possibly be correct. So he called that his greatest blunder. But what do y'all still see as the problem with this oscillating model?
Well, it still doesn't get down to the initial cause, because you have something expanding and contracting, but nowhere does it actually explain where that something comes from. And even when you get into all the weeds of some of these different theories, because they can sound very complicated, and you get into quantum physics and all this different, to me, to almost stretching into imaginary type math, but they still, even if they want to define two molecules in a vacuum, that's still not nothing. Even if you say there is a mass of energy, that's not nothing. And so we have to continually get back to, well, where does even that mass of energy, those two molecules sitting in a vacuum, where did the vacuum come from, right? We have to actually get back to truly nothing, because anything that you start from, that existence must be explained. Just like our 4-year-old understands that everything that we see has a cause to it. So even when you're trying so desperately to sidestep this concept of a discrete, finite beginning, which those words are very key in this type of conversation, you can't sidestep that. No matter how creative you could get, you still, you're always starting with something. I actually watched a video the other day. It was a pretty old conversation, but it was a video of Richard Dawkins speaking to this very issue. And the crowd actually chuckles at what he's saying, because he's going to great lengths to describe what this nothingness is. And it was the audience caught up on the irony there, that here's somebody who's saying that nothing exists before this universe, yet he's describing it as a something. Because we can't get around this concept that there was something there at the beginning. And if you're a naturalist, your only explanation can be nature. And so you have to find a beginning of that somewhere.
There's actually a slightly smaller group of people, and my husband pointed this out when I was putting this together. So you have just the regular naturalism, but you also have something called non-material naturalism, which seems like an oxymoron to me. And so John mentioned that, and I was like, could you explain that one a little bit more? And so he was talking about things like, some people will call themselves, some philosophers, kind of more whatever, just some of the philosophers will call themselves non-material naturalists, because they're talking about things like numbers and laws being real, and those aren't necessary material. It's like we don't have some substance out there that's a 3.14, and we can't point and put in a box gravity. But yet they believe those things are real. They're just not material. So that would go back to Rebecca, yours and my podcast on how to identify nonsense, with the quote from, I believe it was Stephen Hawking, that's saying, because a law like gravity exists, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. So I think we can say that Hawking would be a non-material naturalism guy, where he believes in these things that aren't material. But again, now we've put gravity
he's
in
a supernaturalist. He really is a supernaturalist, and he's saying that mathematics or laws stand in some kind of causal relations with matter, that they can have some kind of will and cause things to happen. And can they? That's the next question you can have. Actually, he is a supernaturalist then, if he says that. He's just not able to, he chokes on the word.
He does. And one of my favorite quotes is actually from him, because he says the reason why we're so uncomfortable with the discrete finite beginning is, he says, it smacks of divine intervention.
Yeah, that reminds me of one of my favorite quotes by a scientist, Robert Jastrow. So this is when I guess the Big Bang, the scientific evidence was just mounting that the universe had a beginning at a discrete time in the past. And so one of the things that the scientist said, he said, for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak, leaving that stupid religion behind. That's mine. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Creation ex nihilo.
Yes. That's God and the Astronomers. I love that quote.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's like the scientist who talks about getting the divine foot in the door. They just...
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the getting the foot in the door, that's Lewontin.
That's Lewontin,
yes.
yeah. I was about to say,
I
that's
was
my
trying to think
molecular
of that one
biology
too,
guy.
yeah. Yeah, we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So we'll go to any type of, like you said, just identify nonsense, any type of theory that we can just grasp at and hopefully sling our hat at, to just not allow that divine foot in the door. And they're so threatened by it because it's so obvious that there has to be some divine intervention, because that naturalism, materialistic explanation just falls flat.
Yeah. Here's the full Lewontin quote here, just because I love it. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. Oh, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So
And I would even say it's a door. It's a tiny little box that they put themselves in, and there's a whole lot that they leave out. Chesterton called it a materialist box that they've painted on the inside with the sun and the moon. They have their own little sun and moon and stars on their little box, because the real sun and moon and stars, okay, anyway.
Right. Well, and I think look at all the creative ways that he has defined nonsense. Right?
Yeah, that's very creative.
So we're going to go, so we have either God is the eternal self-existent being, we have nature as the eternal self-existent being, or the cosmos is the eternal self-existent being. Now we'll deal with the multiverse. So the multiverse is one that, there's kind of two forms of the multiverse. One form of the multiverse just says that there are duplicate universes that are next door to us that we can't really observe, but they exist, and so there's like almost identical to our universe, but there's just more of them. So when you take that one back, they're trying to get away from the idea of God producing the universe by basically saying that there's this universe generator that kind of spits out universes. And a lot of times it'll take a while before, talking to someone before you'll finally get to that level of detail. But that's kind of basically what it comes down to. But again, we still run into the same problem, which is what
created the universe generator. But I have to say, I kind of like the multiverse because it's made for some really interesting science fiction. Have you ever watched Fringe?
Yeah.
It's really cool.
I was just about to say Fringe. Okay.
Alternate
I
universe.
am in like another universe, and I could do like 20 pirouettes like I always wanted to do, and I didn't injure myself, and I ended up becoming a professional ballerina. Anyway. It's kind of fun.
I love Fringe.
A lot of times you can get into the concept of probability and statistics. And granted, I took a lot of that through my schooling. So I guess I know I can go to that. But to me, it's, a lot of times we compare it to the odds of developing this universe with its precision and that technical term of the anthropic fine-tuning, that we would have all of these physical parameters exactly the values they need to be, and they could have been anything out of infinity. So when you look at those probabilities, that not just gravity is what it needs to be, but gravity plus the cosmological constant, which is a multiplier, and the electromagnetic force, and the density of space, and all these other the strong and weak nuclear forces all occurring at the same time. The probability of that is so literally astronomical. Okay, I know we're talking about the the cosmos here, but astronomical that it would actually settle on that by random chance. So if they could, and to me, I see the multiverse as if you're saying this is like, the universe has won the lottery by coming into existence. That even pales in comparison, because it would be like somebody winning the lottery every single day of their lives for 3,000 years. It's those kinds of odds. And so I feel like the multiverse is they're just saying, well, we're just going to buy more lottery tickets.
Yeah, I've actually
it's not
heard a guy
really increasing it's not really, increasing your probability, but you're just kind of saying, well, what if we bought 3 million lottery tickets?
Yeah.
Okay, you still have insurmountable odds to overcome.
Yeah. I've actually heard a guy give that real similar analogy at one of the Bible and Beer consortiums that is in Dallas. And I'm trying to remember which one, Rebecca, because I'm pretty sure you're there for it. But the guy was saying, basically, it's not that we won the lottery. It's more like we went back in time and figured out which numbers they were. And so it shouldn't be so surprising. Or if something is a 1 in a million chance, if you try 1,000,000 times, well, that one time you get it right. So yoo-hoo, we're in the universe that got it right. So there's a quote by another scientist named Paul Davies from A Brief History of the Multiverse. And Paul Davies is not a Christian. He's not a full atheist. He's what we call a deist, meaning it's like a really loose, he believes in a God that kind of wound up the universe and let it go on its own.
He knocked the first domino over.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then the rest of it kind of went. So he says about the multiverse, for a start, how is the existence of the other universes to be tested? To be sure, all cosmologists accept that there are some regions of the universe that lie beyond the reach of our telescopes. But somewhere on the slippery slope between that idea and the idea that there are an infinite number of universes, credibility reaches a limit. As one slips down that slope, more and more must be accepted on faith, and less is open to scientific verification. Extreme multiverse explanations are therefore reminiscent of theological discussions. Indeed, invoking an infinity of unseen universes to explain the unusual features of the one we do see is just as ad hoc, and ad hoc means like just adding an argument to something. It's just as ad hoc as in invoking an unseen creator. The multiverse theory may be dressed up in scientific language, but in essence, it requires the same leap of faith.
Well, and I would say it's worse. It's more like a God of the gaps argument. It's a science of the gaps, because I think that there are arguments for God's existence that are very strong, that are totally independent of science, and that you can make. They're metaphysical arguments.
But I like how he points out the fact, and this is something that I just have a hard time getting people to understand this unless we like really walk through this, is how whenever you get to all these quote unquote scientific theories, they all end up with as much faith or more than the Christian worldview does. So if you're trying to get around having to exercise faith in something, this is not the route you want to go, because now you're exercising faith in an infinite universe generator, or the fact that there is unobservable infinite universes around you. Well, how is that better and more scientific and less faith requiring than say we believe in an infinite God? Because the one thing in my statement, even though a lot of people don't like to talk about it, where I said blank is eternally self-existent and capable of creating. Almost everything that we've described thus far with the other beliefs can be, okay, sure, we can maybe say they're eternally self-existent, but are they capable of creating?
Well, and we're only looking at one slice of our experience, and that's just this cause and effect, right? And this idea of things that didn't exist came into being. They're contingent, right? So we need to explain them. They need an explanation. But there's also things in this like morality and other arguments that absolutely are not even included in this now. If you believe in a multiverse, everything is matter and energy and self-existent in that sense, then where do you get morality from? You have to explain away morality. You have to explain away a lot of our daily experience then becomes nonsensical downstream of these ideas. So
I think that's an excellent point, that it's the totality of our existence that must be explained.
Yeah.
Morality is to me such a compelling argument, because it starts to remove that let's argue over the scientific details, and there's always going to be somebody you're talking with that knows more about math and science than you do. That's just
absolutely,
that's just the fact of life, right?
Yeah.
So when you start sometimes going into all this, and they'll throw out these terms in multiverse, and they, like you said, I love that quote because it says it parades around in such scientific truth, yet it's so much more faith-based than even faith is. A religious faith, because they're believing in something that is not adequate for what they're trying to explain. At least what we have faith in, it is an adequate cause. But there's so much more to our existence, not just the morality, but just the fact that we have a soul. That our spiritual element, we are more than just our physical bodies. And we know that down to our very core. The famous atheists may to your face deny that and publicly deny that, but in their core, they know.
Well, they don't live by it. It's like another thing they'd have to get rid of is the idea of free will. We have no free will. We're absolutely, everything is determined. Even our thoughts. How do we have how do we even have confidence that our thoughts are really correspond to reality when there's no, it's all random chance. There's no sort of order in the universe. This is all just.
And why would you argue for that? Like, if I'm going to sit here and argue for that, like, basically I'm arguing, like, who am I trying to convince? All of y'all are predetermined to think what you are going to think by your chemicals anyway. So this is kind of.
So you have to explain away almost everything in our daily experience that we take as real and common sense.
Especially as a scientist, I find that to be the biggest irony as well. Like, I would almost give philosophers, because they can really get out there on the fringe, or somebody that is more arts related, but a true scientist that then wants to say it's all random, and yet you're basing science on it being a fixed situation. I always find that a little bit comical.
I was just going to say, I would also say, because you say everybody knows that, and I think Rebecca is a little bit closer in saying that nobody lives like that, because I actually know a man who was a lifelong atheist who's now become a Christian. He actually attends a Catholic church, but in having a discussion with him the other day, because I thought we were mostly on the same page with everything, I discovered that he's a monist, meaning he only believes in one substance. So he does believe that the soul's an illusion. I'm like, what? How can you believe? Like, what do you think happens when we die? And he's like, well, I think it's just, poof, like a candle. I'm like, what's the purpose of Christianity? And he said, well, I mean, I don't say I have everything figured out. He's on the journey. But just to say, I just wanted to point out that there are some people who legitimately, it's not evident to them that they have a soul. However, he absolutely lives like he has a soul.
Just like the people that say we have no free will, they live as if we have free will.
Right. And that's what I mean by it. Like, they would never admit that, and they're still struggling somewhere in their intellect with it. But deep down, like, like you're saying, I guess that sums it up a little bit better than what I was trying to say, that they live like there is such a thing as a soul. They as though they recognize that we are more than just a material entity, even though they would not confess that openly with their mouths, or maybe they still, don't believe it in their minds, but that's what I mean, like, deep down.
Yeah.
There is this understanding that we do have an immaterial aspect to us.
Well, and then the other thing is that another great example is this idea of people that say, well, there's no God and there really is no objective good and evil, right? And it's all cultural, or it's evolution that's programmed it into us, but they don't live that way. They live as if when Trump was elected, that was a moral evil, and the way you see them acting on Facebook, they act that way. So it's like they're denying a part of their daily experience to accept this. So actually, I think they have more faith than Christianity, because Christianity does not go against our daily experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, Christianity doesn't go against our daily experience, except for when it comes to the idea, I think, the problem of evil. I would say that's the one area where Christianity does seem to speak against our daily experience. I look at all this stuff and how could God be good? Now, I believe there's good answers to that, but I've been dialoguing with a girl just this week who is an atheist, who's contacted Mama Bear and was asking some questions about one of my recent posts on the why did God create the tree, and she was kind of saying how Christianity doesn't jive with her everyday experience, and there's to an extent I can actually understand that. I think, but study Christian,
see, the thing that frustrates me is that, though, if you get on an atheistic worldview, you reject God because there's evil in the world and he doesn't stop it. But then on an atheistic worldview, you can't really explain the existence of good and evil. So not only do you get rid of evil, you get rid of good. And so you have to get rid of more.
Yeah, I think, again, like I said, I think it has a good answer to it, but it doesn't take sin into account, and I think that's the real weakness of it, is when people have a real problem with the problem of evil. It doesn't take sin into account, it doesn't take eternity into account.
Right.
And if you take those two things out of the equation, then absolutely none of it makes sense.
Well, and I think, and that could be a whole separate series of podcasts to really address that issue. But I'll throw this out there quickly, because I know we need to probably get back to what the actual topic of tonight was. But what I found interesting, and when you look at the existence of evil and suffering and pain, that all the other worldviews out there are trying to find a way to disconnect from that, as if that's not what life really should be about. So when you look, especially some of the Eastern religions, it's deny reality, cease to exist in an individuated being, and detach yourself from this world. And the whole focus, especially, the whole focus of Buddhism is to eliminate suffering. So so a lot of worldviews are fully dedicated on detaching from suffering, but yet suffering is a very real part of our existence. And when you really look at Scripture, the biblical faith says that is what this world is. And we have an explanation for it. Obviously, that's where you get sin entering into creation. But it says this is normal. So our issue with it is that we desire a utopia that God says that's not what it's going to be right now. And so when you really stop and look at it from that perspective, Christianity is the only one that deals with suffering in the real way of what our world is actually like.
Amen. Yeah, I agree. All of the other religions... We got to get off
the topic of... Let's get back to the topic, because we could have a whole other podcast.
We could.
We probably will have a whole other podcast on that. But just bringing it back to the topic of who made God, let's kind of see where we've come from that. Whenever your child is asking who made God, take them back to the question that they're really asking, is where did the universe come from? And then start asking them to think of some other options. What are some of the things that you hear your friends saying? What are some of the things that you hear your science teachers saying? What are some things that you hear, or if they're older, your professors saying? And start trying to get them to give you another worldview. And how that worldview answers it. Because as we've gone through all the naturalist ones with, the static model, the cyclic oscillating model, and the multiverse, And the non-material naturalism, where it's talking about the pre-existence of, gravity and other natural laws, all of those come back to the same faith statement of blank is eternally self-existent and capable of creating. Let's look a little bit at the supernaturalism, because remember we said your options are either naturalism or supernaturalism. So in supernaturalism, we have the easy one, which is the Abrahamic faith. That's going to be Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And we, of course, say that God is eternally self-existent and capable of creating, which makes sense because if you have to have something that's eternally self-existent and capable of creating, having something that has a mind seems preferable than something that does not have a mind, seen as creation is pretty various. It's not like a repeating pattern like you see in ice. That's something that natural laws can put something in order together like ice, but it's a repeating pattern. You don't see stuff like that in things like DNA. But then secondly, we have like our Eastern and pantheistic beliefs, which are still supernaturalism because they believe in God. But one of the things that the Eastern and pantheistic beliefs do is that they kind of merge God and the universe as indistinguishable from one another. So basically, instead of saying just God is eternal and self-existent, it's saying that both God and nature are eternally self-existent and capable of creating. But there's a lot of problems with making those two things indistinguishable, because this is where you get some of the wacky beliefs with some of the people, like where if you squash a bug, you've committed a moral evil because you've now like squashed God in some way. Or cutting down trees or doing anything. But it also means that change is an illusion, because if you have God who is unchanging, you can't actually change God. And so that's kind of some of the cyclical thinking that you start getting in some of those Eastern and pantheistic models. So that's our first tactic, to take kids to find out what other options that they think, and even let them stew over it for several days. What's another explanation that you can come up with? And whatever the explanation they come up with, walk them back to that faith statement of blank is eternally self-existent and capable of creating. They're going to have a faith statement. So why should we have a faith statement in God? And so, Catherine, this is actually a whole section in your book. Namely the cosmological argument. So why don't you walk us through kind of how you explained that? Like, why do we think God is a better explanation than some of these other things like natural laws and gravity and the universe and the multiverse and all that other stuff?
Well, we've kind of covered a lot of the same type of ground that I cover in that first chapter in the book, because this is, really the pivotal thing that you have to get through before you can really start assessing religion is, is there really a God? And to me, the first stopping point is this cause and effect idea. So especially when we're talking about dealing with your children, I always like to use a simple illustration just to get them thinking along that path of that cause and effect. And a lot of times when I go and teach, I demonstrate by pouring a pitcher of water into a cup, and I say, here's the cause, I'm pouring water out, and here's the effect, the cup is filled with glass. And it's just a simple illustration to get us back to, our third grade science class of, every effect must have a cause, and every cause has an effect. The cause is always before the effect, and the cause and the effect are always adequate to one another. Because I think the adequacy of it is something you're hitting on there about that eternal entity being a mind or being a divine spirit or something moral, because those would be adequate explanations for what our existence is when we look at the totality of our existence, right? When we take all that into account.
Just a side note for that would be basically Newton's third law. And so like this is a law of our universe we're talking about. This is not something that we see happen most of the time. It happens consistently enough that we call it a law and not a hypothesis, not a theory.
Right.
This is
And
Newton's
it's called
third law.
And it's called, the laws of causality as well, that tell you this is how our world works. And we can take that as a solid presumption of fact, because we know this is how things work. Like you said, this is not just, some of the time it does that, but we know for a fact that this is how the world around us works. So to me, the next logical outflow, like you said at the beginning, I always kind of get us to two branches. Okay, either or, where are we headed? Which direction are we taking? Is then we have to ask, well, what caused the universe? And so we first have to look at that concept that we really spent the first half of this talking about, is that eternal nature. If the universe is eternal, then it doesn't need a cause. It's just always existed and always will exist. And so it's important to establish that it's truly not. That all these other theories that we've kind of touched on here, that obviously you could go way more in depth than what we've talked about, but the multiverse, the oscillating universe, and all these things are they're trying to imply that the universe is eternal. But everything else that we know about science tells us that it's not. We see that things are decaying, and eternal things don't decay.
Yeah. And just a side note for that, you said, that if the universe is eternal, then it doesn't need a cause. I think we need to insert one more step in there. The reason why something, if it's eternal, it doesn't need a cause is because something that's eternal means that it never started to exist and it never ceased to exist. So something that never began to exist doesn't need a cause because nothing was caused. It always has been. So that's one of those ones you could probably sit and, wrap your noodle around for a while. I just wanted to
think on that
to clarify that.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, because we'll actually come back to that very point in just a minute. That becomes a crucial part of our kind of building this case for God's existence. So if we know even through and I know a common thing that that Christians put out and that atheists try to debunk, which I find fascinating to sit back and watch, is when we talk about the laws of thermodynamics, which we can put in, which we addressed one of them in that things decay, and that is a law of nature that things are decaying, and eternal things would not be decaying; they would be in the same eternal, pristine condition, and that's not what our universe is, and the universe can't create its own matter and energy. So when you kind of couple all of these things together, the fact that we do see the universe expanding, it had to have come from a point from which to expand. And you factor in all of these other things that we talk about from science. And, atheists have even named it. They called it the Big Bang. I mean, they have admitted there is a starting point. Okay, we can get into a lot of variations of their theory, but they're all coming back to there is a starting point from which everything began, and which tells us it's not eternal, which goes to what, Hillary, what you were just saying, that we now have to have a cause. And so then logically, when you step into that, okay, something, we need a cause. So it either caused itself or something else caused it. There's no in between.
Two options. There's nothing else.
There's no in between on that. So when we look at the logic, could it have caused itself? Well, we can go back to those laws of causality. Could the cause and the effect be the same thing? And we see, from our simple illustrations, from logic.
I gave, and this was one of the myths that I addressed in our little Mythbusters thing with the 3rd through 5th graders. And so one of the things that I did was I had them all write a story. And in their story, they were able to create a new law for themselves, something that is unique in their universe. I said it could be anything from, when you hiccup, a bell rings, or when you drop stuff, it falls up, create your own law. And so, I made my law that whenever, oh golly, what was it? Something that someone could concentrate hard enough and they could hover above the ground, basically. And so someone could push them. So in the story, it's like, some kids were late for a bus, and so one of them said, I can't get my shoes on. They were like, well, quick, hover. So they hovered and were able to push them to the bus stop. So if I were to say one of those characters, could any of the characters in this story have written this story? There is no way for this story to have been written outside of someone outside of this piece of paper writing this story. I named all my characters and, Billy and Johnny and stuff like that. I'm like, could Billy have written this story? No, because Billy's in the story. He can't reach outside and write his own existence. It's just, like you said, it's illogical.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point to make. I think that's probably a good illustration that's going to stick with them for a while.
Yeah, I hope so. And also for you were kind of dropping a couple of $2 words there. So the second law of thermodynamics, you actually kind of mentioned the first and second. So the first law is that matter can never be created or destroyed. So this is talking about in natural causes. So we already know it can't be created or destroyed, but for some reason the naturalists like to say, except for when it created itself. Now we as Christians can say except for when God created it, because it can't create itself from nothing on its own, but someone outside, just like I was able to write on the piece of paper and create that story, I could create that story from nothing, but none of the characters could. And then the second law of thermodynamics, which you were talking about, decay. back when I taught chemistry and biology, I always used the analogy of a teenager's bedroom. Basically, just leave it for a little while. And really,
Entropy.
this doesn't even just go for
Right.
it doesn't even go for teenagers. I know that some parents, it's like they make the house pristine. They turn around for 1 second and turn back around, and it's like the whole place is exploded. So it doesn't take a lot of effort. It naturally tends towards disorder. My office, my home, everything, it naturally tends towards disorder. I have to put a lot of energy into putting it back into order again. And even though that's different from what we're talking about necessarily with energy, it's a good analogy of just showing how things tend towards disorder. So decay, like if you leave food out, is gonna start breaking down. That's essentially what it's doing, is breaking down.
Right. I've often used the example of your backyard. Until you apply energy into the system, it's not going to look like the pristine garden. Mine doesn't,
so
even when I put energy
using
in it.
some of these when you're trying to get your husband or teenage son to mow the lawn, and be like, look, according to the second law of thermodynamics, the lawn is not going to mow itself
unless your energy is applied to the backyard.
Yep.
Right. Exactly. So, and those are all great, illustrations to remind our mamas out there of how you can make these seemingly complex ideas. I mean, if you were to tell your 5-year-old the second law of thermodynamics, he wouldn't understand. But if you say your room is a wreck, you must go clean it. That they understand, right? Maybe. So it's good to get those illustrations to put because it is a fact of life that it is a law for a reason, because this is how our world works. So,
Yep.
So if we go back to to the logical step of it could not have created itself, and I love that analogy that you did with the story, because when you think about the characters in the story could not have created the story, because they would have to already exist in order to write the story. So how did they come to be to then make themselves come to be if they didn't exist already? So that's how you see this big circular logic that you would walk in.
Yeah.
You can't create yourself, one, unless you have enough power to create, and your characters in the story are powerless to create their own story, but then they have to already exist, and if they already exist, then they don't need to create themselves. So you see that this is an illogical proposition to say that it created itself. So if we are standing at this fork in the road of our either or, and our only two options is it created itself or it didn't, and we know it can't have created itself, that means something else did. Something outside of this existence had to have created us. And so I always love to draw this back in, because if we define our existence as time, space, energy, and matter, and so something outside of our existence had to have created us, then it also is something that exists outside of time, space, energy, and matter. Right?
Sounds familiar.
Right. So it has to be outside of this nature. And I think this was probably the line that I think Rebecca opened with in this whole discussion, is that it has to be something completely outside of our understanding of what is contained in nature. It's outside of that materialism box.
And our laws that we have, these laws of causality, these are really we are talking about things that are happening within nature. These are laws, these are observations. Laws are based on observations within. We cannot come up with laws of something outside of nature, because we have no experience and we can see their effects, right?
Yeah.
But
I've heard someone jokingly say, the fact that the number million exists never put $1 million in my bank account. It's like numbers don't cause anything.
Yeah.
It's like they describe things. I can the number 5 will never give me 5 apples. However, if there's 5 apples there, I can describe the 5 apples.
Right. Now it has meaning because there's something there.
Yeah.
Right.
So we're pretty much at the end of our time, so we'll just kind of review again.
I want to throw one thing out before we wrap it up.
Okay.
So because the whole premise of this is really get into who made God, and we've often said, well, God is eternal; He's outside of this existence, and so I've often thought, well, are we sidestepping this idea simply by saying, well, we'll just declare that God's eternal? Right. So now he doesn't need a cause, like we said initially. But there's a great way of reasoning through this to understand why God has to be eternal, or something has to be eternal. And and I put it, to me, the picture's worth 1,000 words. And I do have a great diagram of this in my book, but I love showing how if in the concept, I really, is from R.C. Sproul. If you truly had at some point no universe, because we know at some point there was no universe, right?
Yeah.
There, it's hard for us to think about that, but there was no universe. If there were no God, no eternal existence anywhere, and no universe, then we would still have nothing.
Yeah.
Because nothing could ever create something.
Yeah.
So if there's no universe, which we know that's a fact, and no God, we would still have nothing now.
Yeah.
So the fact that we have something now says that something must exist eternally to step into the nothingness and create.
Something has
And
to
so-
be totally uncaused.
Right.
Because something that is an effect cannot give rise to another effect. So if we're saying God is just an effect, he can't be. He has to be uncaused. He has to be
Exactly.
Or like as Aquinas would say, he's pure actuality. He is. He does not have to be brought into being at all. He just exists, and it relates beautifully to God. What God told Abraham, what God, who does he? Moses. He tells Moses to say, "Tell him that I am sent you." But he's saying existence itself. Anyway, I don't know if that makes sense.
Right. No, it's a great point. And that's the thing, that there has to be some eternal existence somewhere. So just by saying, well, God made everything, and who made God? Well, God doesn't need a cause because he's eternal. We have a solid logical way of knowing that that is necessarily true. He is that necessary, eternal, uncaused cause existence that has to be there in order for something to be here now.
Yep. So just kind of a little fun story to end on, and then I'll give a summary. This is a quote from Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. And it's something I remember as a kid, my dad reading and hearing him laugh and him reading it to us. And so it's kind of been this joke ever since. But this is a quote from that. It says, "A well-known scientist, some say it was Bertrand Russell, once gave a public lecture on astronomy. He described how the Earth orbits around the sun and how the sun in turn orbits around the center of a vast collection of stars called our galaxy. At the end of the lecture, a little old lady at the back of the room got up and said, 'What you have told us is rubbish. The world is really a flat plate supported on the back of a giant tortoise.' The scientist gave a superior smile before replying, 'What is the tortoise standing on?' And she says, 'You're very clever, young man, very clever,' said the old lady, 'but it's turtles all the way down.'" And that's kind of been a joke in our family. It's turtles all the way down. But it goes back to the same idea of who made God, that no matter what you come to, whether you come to the static model that the universe, the cosmos, is eternally self-existent and capable of creating, or the oscillating model that an expanding and contracting universe is eternally self-existent and capable of creating, a multiverse, there's a multiverse generator, but that's also eternally self-existent and capable of creating. You can go into anything. You can even say turtles. It's turtles all the way down. But no matter what you come to, there is always a faith component. And so when we give our children the answer that requires faith, it's okay for them to accept it on faith, because no matter what view they accept, they will have to accept it on faith. And if we can get that concept through their heads, that our view isn't faith and the other faith is science, it's our view is faith and the other view is also faith. And if they still think that it's still science, just kind of keep pushing them. Okay, well, tell me what made that. Tell me what made that. They will finally get back to something that's eternally self-existent and capable of creating.
And the final question you ask is, which one of these faiths describes, encompasses your total experience? Which one of these faiths do you have to ignore certain things in your experience, or what can you accept? I don't know how to say it. You can cut this out, but what faith explains your world the best?
The most.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Has the
No,
best
I think
explanatory
that's a
power. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a valid question. And, some of your kids will be a little too young for that. But, as they start getting older, you can start, giving them some more of this. So
Yeah, and that's exactly, what cause is adequate.
Mm-hmm.
When we get back
It
to the
is.
laws of causality, it must be adequate. And so
Yep.
the naturalism explanation, their cause is inadequate to fully explain this life that we have.
Naturalism turns out to be too simple.
It does. So that is, I think we're a little bit over time. Hopefully we did not just like turn a fire hose of information on all our mama bears. Hang in there. Some might want to listen to this 2 or 3 times to get it all, because I know that we put a lot of information in there. But we hope that it was helpful, and for whatever level your child is at, we hope we were able to adequately answer this question for every single different maturity level, all the way from the little kid up to the college student. So Catherine, would you like to pray us out tonight?
Sure, I will.
Thanks.
Dear Father, I just thank you so much for this time to get together and just reaffirm your existence, your almighty power, that you are the supreme being that created us, and we owe you all of our praise and our worship, and you are deserving of all of that. And I pray for all the mama bears that are out there, that you'll just give them the encouragement and the strength and the boldness that they need to share that confidence of their faith with their children, and that they can begin to show the reality of who you are and the amazing thing that you've done for your creation by giving up of yourself, of your sacrificing your son on the cross for our sins while we were still condemned and unclean, that you were willing to die for us. And that's what this is all about. And so I just pray that you'll give each of those mama bears that strength and that boldness, that this fight that we have over our children and for their faith is obviously, definitely, eternally worth it. Yeah. And so these things we pray in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.
Amen.
This has been a Mama Bear Apologetics recording.
To learn more about Mama Bear Apologetics, please visit us on the web at www.mamabearapologetics.com.
Have you been stumped by your kids already?
Or maybe you have a nagging question of your own that you think would make a good podcast.
Send us an email to askthemamabears@gmail.com, and we will do our best.
Rise up, ladies.
Rise up, Mama Bears.
We are all in this together.